Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Let's bore the people pantsless right from the beginning. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
We've had contact with a number of our listeners this week. I got a Christmas card from Amy Imbroglio.
I got one of those too.
Did you? We have known her since she was Amy Peters, where you mocked her on one of the episodes.
She said she wanted to hear her name come out of our mouths. So, I mean,
and there
people should get what they want.
And then we had lunch this week. We're in the Charlotte area, and several of our listeners joined us. Donovan Biggs, David Hudson, and Peter Stolmack.
That was pretty cool.
This week, I want to talk about mistranslations, miscommunications of company slogans. And this came to light with Kia's new logo. Apparently, Kia came out with a new logo. The I and the A are stylized to look like an N, and what happened is all of a sudden there's been a surge in Google searches for KN. People are misreading this.
And I've seen this, and I can't figure out what they were going for
Well,
with this.
I had problems with their original logo. The original logo, the KIA, and the horizontal bars left off of the A. Anyone who's trained in mathematics, you read that as Greek letters, kappa, iota, lambda, which is pronounced kill, which I don't think is a very good name for a car. But that called to mind interesting mistranslations. In the 1920s, Coca-Cola translated phonetically, of course you have to, into Chinese, their name, which came out as Bite the Wax Tadpole.
Oh, that sounds about right.
Pepsi also, when they translated their slogan, Come Alive with the Pepsi Generation, into Taiwanese, it came out as Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. And then KFC, finger licking good. I don't know if they still use that slogan. That was their slogan back in our day. Translated into Chinese as eat your fingers off.
That's not great either.
No, nothing is good here. These are all due to the problem of having to translate a language phonetically. You have a similar problem translating into more similar languages. For example, English to French. Coca-Cola, again, their jingle, Have a Coke and a Smile, translated correctly into French, although when the words were sung, they came out as Have a Coke and a Mouse.
These are ridiculous.
The poster child, of course, is General Motors' Chevy Nova, marketed in Latin America. The word Nova means, in both English and Spanish, an exploding star. But when spoken aloud, if you put a pause, Nova, it translates into it doesn't go.
Well, come to find out, that was actually true.
Right. There was some truth in advertising there. And then you have acts of God. Wind caused an unfortunate alteration of a Coke slogan in skywriting in Cuba. The ad written, of course, the plane drawing the thing in the sky, was supposed to read in Spanish, drink Coca-Cola. The wind blurred one of the letters, making the translation fear Coca-Cola.
I mean, that's actually good advice from the perspective of the Cuban regime.
Right, yeah, exactly, you're right.
If we could get enough Coke and enough McDonald's into that country, that regime would fall.
And then here in the U.S., when the Pope visited Miami some years ago, an entrepreneur printed T-shirts with the logo, I saw the Pope, but in Spanish. He got the article incorrect. Instead of El Papa, which would be the Pope, he put La Papa, which is the potato. His shirts, no doubt, didn't sell.
If he's out there anywhere listening to this, I would like to have a couple of these shirts.
I would love to have one, right.
That is absolutely hilarious. People mail me all kinds of crazy things all the time, but nobody bothers with T-shirts. Let's elevate our game here.
Once in a while, we'll get a T-shirt from a fan. Trent Goldsmith, one of our teachers out in Omaha, the Waverly High School T-shirt. You wear it from time to time, I notice.
It's one of my favorite shirts. I've got something that's just fascinating, and it's going to be even more fascinating tomorrow. So by the time this episode airs, everybody will already know what happened. But it seems to be the case that scientists have figured out how to make an atomic reaction that creates more energy than it consumes.
This is the fusion business.
Yeah, and if this happens, this is a game changer for the entire world.
Energy becomes virtually free.
That's correct.
And the carbon output is zero.
If energy is no longer a massive expense incurred by every member of the human race, we are very unlikely to have the same kind of hostilities between and among nations that we do right now.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We're going to see a global change of the magnitude that we have never seen.
Yeah.
They're going to make their announcement on Tuesday, which is tomorrow for us as we record this. And by the time this episode airs, everybody would have already heard this. So if you haven't heard it, go take a look for it.
Every time you and I talk about the burgeoning federal debt, the fact that the federal government's just not going to get out from under it, when people ask, is there any way out of this? We've both said the only possible way out is through the discovery of some technology that's on the order of magnitude of like the internet was, that pushes us ahead by a leap and a bound. Fusion would be exactly that.
That's exactly right. And I can't wait to hear this announcement tomorrow. From the sublime, we go to the ridiculous. We're back to our old friend, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
What has Marjorie said now?
In the House of Representatives sent by the good people of one district in Georgia, she said, referring to the January 6th nonsense, then January 6th happened, and the next thing you know, I organized the whole thing along with Steve Bannon. If Steve Bannon and I had organized that, we would have won. Not to mention, it would have been armed.
Not the sort of thing you want to be saying.
I mean, I ask this constantly, what's wrong with her?
Well, now remember, she's playing to a particular audience.
The Congress should refuse to seat her. They can do that. The Congress can refuse to seat someone who has won an election. It's one of those safeguards built into the Constitution. If I were in Congress, I would be waving my hands feverishly right now, saying, let's not let her back in.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. This week, Words and Numbers is recording live at Lebanon Valley College in Annville, Pennsylvania.
Thanks for being here. I'm Anthony Davies. I'm an economist at Duquesne University. This is my colleague James Harrigan, who's a political scientist with the
American Institute for Economic Research.
Thank you. I only ever see the letters in my head. Yeah. We're going to talk to you about the price of free stuff. And what happens is in this country, every generation or so, we get this bee in our bonnet about we want free stuff, whether it's free healthcare or free whatever it is. Free education is the thing now. And of course, politicians make a lot of hay using this word free because everybody likes it. And we want to look at this from the perspective of an economist and political scientist and ask what actually is the price of this free stuff. And this story we're going to tell you begins with a breakdown in barriers. If you go back to the founding of the United States up to the present, we've lost three important barriers. The first was the Constitution itself. Article 1, Section 8 lists the things the federal government is permitted to do. And round about the 1920s, we decided that we didn't like that anymore, and we kind of ignored it. And we started allowing the federal government to do all sorts of things that went beyond Article 1, Section 8. Some very good ideas, some not so good ideas, but the point is they went outside of Article 1, Section 8. And then the voters all of a sudden discovered, hey, we've got this federal government that could do all kinds of things. Let's start voting into office politicians who want to give us stuff. So we go from this model of unlimited spending now, because there are no constitutional constraints, to unlimited borrowing. Because if you're a politician and you're armed with a government now that doesn't have constitutional constraints, you can spend as much as you want. I want to get elected. How do I get elected? By spending on what you want. And you'll elect me. The problem is it's got to be paid for. And you don't like taxes. So how do I square that circle if I want to spend more money without taxing you? And the answer is we borrow. And so we end up with unlimited borrowing. And then finally, the third breakdown in barriers was the gold standard. We went off the gold standard in bits and pieces, ending round about the 1970s, and we started to actually make use of the fact that we're off the gold standard in the 1990s, and this led to unlimited financing, where you can now pay for whatever it is that you want simply by printing money.
What you end up seeing here is a perfect storm. When you do away with the Constitution, you give the voters what they want, and you don't have any barrier against government spending or borrowing, you end up with the debt that we now have, well over $30 trillion. And that goes up every single year. Sooner or later, it will be so high that we can't pay it. But not only can we not pay it, we won't be able to pay the interest on it. And when that comes to pass, we're going to have a catastrophe.
Outlay is the technical term we use for all the money the federal government spends. The rate of growth changes in almost three distinct places. In that first place corresponds to when we decide, okay, Article 1, Section 8 doesn't matter, we're going to do all kinds of things that we want to do. First and largest amongst them was Social Security. Now, we're not arguing that Social Security was a bad idea. We're simply arguing that it's outside of the bounds of Article 1, Section 8.
Hang on now. Social Security was a bad idea.
You might argue that, but either way, the fact is it goes outside the bounds. And then the voters start getting into the act, and we want the Great Society and all sorts of various things that we have here. The GI Bill, which was the free college version for people in the military that we're now talking about for the rest of us. And then finally going off the gold standard there, you see this ratcheting up of federal outlays, and that's adjusted for inflation, right? This up you're seeing is not inflation. This is actual real purchasing power of federal outlays. And that leaves us where James is talking about, the federal debt. Federal debt was, in 1967, 2.5 times the federal government's annual income. Today, it's 7 times the federal government's annual income.
A lot of people think that we had a balanced budget under Bill Clinton. This is not correct. We did not. It was close, but it was not balanced. We actually haven't had a balanced budget since, what was it, 1958?
Eisenhower.
Right.
And to give Clinton credit, he came closer than any modern president to balancing the budget. If you Google deficit numbers for the United States and you look in the Clinton era, you'll see a couple of years that actually shows positive numbers. And what's going on here is there was a redefinition of how we accounted for money drawn out of Social Security. So the federal government takes money from the Social Security surplus and uses it to spend. During that era, we redefined that as income. It's like you taking your credit card to an ATM machine and taking a cash advance on your credit card and calling that income. If you do that, well, then you get surpluses. But actually, we had deficits all the way through. Going back to Eisenhower.
We should make a note here, too, that this idea that there is money set aside for Social Security, you often hear about it as a trust fund. It's empty. There's no money there. All of that money got spent by politicians, and that's going to lead to real problems down the road, too.
One of the problems that this leads to with the massive debt that we have now, who knows how much? Yeah, 31 trillion. And interestingly, that does not count another big thing, which is money the federal government has promised to current and future retirees that it won't have the money to pay. We're not sure what that number is, but estimates range from a high of 300 trillion to a low of 100 trillion.
Notice that we can't pinpoint the amount. There is a $200 trillion variance in the possibilities.
Right, yeah.
That's ridiculous.
But what I want to talk about here is just the official debt. So this is the $31 trillion that the federal government has borrowed. And one of the interesting things that's been happening over the past couple of decades is the government's running out of places to borrow. Back in 2001, 42% of the federal debt was owned by the Social Security Trust Fund. 31% was owned by quote-unquote Americans, so think about American citizens, individuals, think about American companies. 18% was owned by foreign entities, basically foreign governments, but also foreign corporations and foreign individuals. And then the Federal Reserve owned 9% of the federal debt. That's what it looked like in 2001. Now let me show you what it looks like today. Social Security Trust Fund now owns much less of the federal debt than it did before. The reason is, round about 2010, for the first time in Social Security's history, it started bringing in less money than it was paying out. So not only did it not have more money to loan to the federal government, the money that it had loaned in the past, it needed that back to pay for retirees. What's happened here is, as you go across these 20 years, the federal government's borrowing more and more, and Social Security's loaning less and less. Americans are loaning a little bit more, foreigners are loaning a bit more, but there's a gap, an extra amount of money that the federal government can't come up with. Who's filling that gap is the Federal Reserve. Now, when the Federal Reserve loans money to the government, something different happens than when anybody else loans money to the government. Because when you loan money to the government, or the Chinese loan money to the government, or whatever it is, that's dollars in the economy going from your pocket to the government, or from the Chinese pockets to the government. The dollars are all within the system. But when the Federal Reserve loans to the government, the Federal Reserve's outside the system. These are new dollars that come in. This is the printing of the money. And the money supply starts to grow as the Federal Reserve loans more and more to the government.
Don't think that all of this is horrible. It actually isn't. What you end up seeing from a foreign policy perspective is a very cheap, easy way to keep the peace. When you look at entities that do business with each other, what you end up finding is a peaceful relationship over time. That's how you know that China, for all of its bluster, is going to remain a good trading partner for the United States. That does yield all kinds of good results, and economists don't think about that, political scientists do.
Yeah, and there you can think just practically. Look, we owe the Chinese government about $1 trillion, and people get wigged out about that. One of the things that people will say to me is, oh my God, this is horrible. We owe them $1 trillion. What if tomorrow the Chinese decide they want their money back? People say they'll call in the loans. That's not a thing. You can't call in the loan. The way this works is when somebody loans money to the federal government, you give the federal government your money, and the federal government hands you what we call a treasury bill or a treasury bond. Treasury bill or a treasury bond is a contract, and it says, the United States government promises to pay you a certain amount of money on a specific date. You can't just show up one day and say, well, I want my money back. It's not the way it works. So this thing about the Chinese could call in debt is nonsense. But as James says, quite rightly, look, if we owe the Chinese $1 trillion, the Chinese are going to think twice, for all their bluster, about getting involved in some kind of shooting match with the United States, because what happens? Well, we're just not going to pay you. And then all of a sudden, from day one, whatever this conflict is, just cost you $1 trillion. This is kind of, from a political perspective, it's actually a good thing. It causes neighbors to be much more friendlier. So where we are here, the Federal Reserve has become, how many of you heard this term, lender of last resort? If you're an econ student, you've probably heard this. When the Federal Reserve was founded, it was founded to be, quote unquote, the lender of last resort. And what that meant was, and you have to think back to, these are Americans coming right out of the Great Depression, and one of the big problems in the Great Depression is that people went to their bank to get their savings out, and there was no money there. The bank fails. And if there's no money there, I can't get my money out, I can't pay you. And if I can't pay you, you can't pay other people, and all of a sudden the whole economy starts to grind to a halt. So the Fed is created to be this lender of last resort, and the idea is, if you go to the bank to get your money out and the bank doesn't have any money to give you, it can turn to the Fed and say, look, you got to loan me some money because this guy wants his money back. It's the lender of last resort. That's what the term has come to mean. Well, interestingly, in today's environment, the Fed is becoming the lender of last resort, not to banks, but to the federal government itself. It's the place the federal government goes when it can't find money elsewhere. From 2010 up until the age of COVID, the money supply, how much money there is in the economy, was growing at about 6% a year. And you can see it's pretty steady along there. And then you hit the age of COVID. And in the age of COVID, the federal government did something unprecedented, even counting things like World War II. It spent a huge amount of money. We spent, what, like $6 trillion in one, even adjusted for inflation and adjusted for the size of the economy, whatever. It was like 50% more than we spent fighting World War II, just in those first few months of COVID. And that's what you see here, this massive increase in the money supply. Instead of 6% a year, we get 16% per year.
Right, and when the money supply grows, each dollar is worth less, and you get this.
Yeah. So this inflation that everybody's talking about now and that you're feeling if you own a car, you feel it badly every time you go to fill up the tank. Prior to COVID, we were running along at about 1 and 1.7, less than 2% inflation per year, sometimes more, sometimes less.
The Fed's goal is always 2%, right?
Yeah,
that's
2%.
Their stated goal. They hit it almost all the time.
Yeah, until COVID, and you get now the average of 6.5. As of right now, I think we're experiencing like 8.5%. Or so, but an average of 6.5 since COVID. Now, here's the thing that baffled us, and James and I talked about this for a long time, all the way back in late 2020, mid-2021, and that's these two pictures that seem to be missing something. On the one hand, when you talk about pre-COVID versus post-COVID, you see the money supply growth increasing by 10 percentage points. We go from 6% to 16%, so money supply growth up 10 percentage points. Other things equal, I would expect inflation to also be up 10 percentage points, because when you print a lot of money, you get inflation. But inflation is only up about 5 percentage points. And that leaves this question: where's the other 5%? In fact, this is something that people were saying way back in mid-2020 with all the money that we were spending, and people were saying, well, this thing the economists say about you print money, you get inflation, that must be wrong because we're not seeing the inflation.
Well, we're not seeing enough inflation.
You're not seeing enough inflation. Even now, we're not seeing enough inflation.
That's right, but we do see a lot of inflation. Mm-hmm. And there's a big chunk that's not here. Where is it?
Where is it? And so what happened is, we're thinking about this, and we noticed something fascinating. When COVID hits and we do the lockdown, you can see real GDP plummet. And what does the stock market do? The stock market does come down a bit, but it doesn't plummet. Now, stop and think about this for a minute. That recession was the worst economic upheaval we have had in this country since the Great Depression. Unemployment peaked at like 14%, which is topped only by the Great Depression. This was the second worst thing that has ever happened to us economically. And yet, look what happened to the stock market. Okay, it comes down a little bit, but then it turns right around and shoots up. And look at what it's doing when unemployment is 9%, which in the age of COVID, 9%, you can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Wow, that's great. Under normal circumstances, that's Armageddon, 9% unemployment. And look at what the stock market's doing. It's shooting up. Why, in this second to worst economic upheaval ever, would the stock market be rising like that? That doesn't make sense. What we hypothesize is that the inflation that we weren't seeing, that missing 5%, we hypothesize it was hiding in the stock market. That increase that you're seeing in stock prices in the S&P 500, and we all cheer and we say, hey, that's great, stock market's up. And everybody says this is an indication of a vibrant economy. We argue that actually that was the missing inflation. It wasn't an indication of a strong economy. It was an indication of all this money that the Fed had pumped into the money supply.
I think it took us at least a year to crack this, right? This took a while because the data's not immediately available. You can see the trends a little, but not enough. And you just kind of have to sit back and wait. On the podcast, we always tell people, look, whatever you're worried about now, we'll tell you in 2 years what the deal was, right? Because there's this 2-year lag if you want good data. But when we found this, it was like the clouds parted and the sun came shining through again. We can't see any other place where this 5% can be hidden.
Now, we're open to the fact we might be wrong on this.
Yeah.
But I think James is right. You look around, I can't see any alternate explanation for where this missing 5% inflation goes. And in fact, if you look at the S&P 500, on average, the S&P returns 12% per year prior to COVID. After COVID, 17%. Not coincidentally, 5 percentage points higher than what was happening prior to COVID. That's our missing 5%. As everybody's saying during, as the government's printing this money, and have you heard of modern monetary theory? Modern monetary theory is what would have been a fringe thing within economics, started to get some serious press because modern monetary theory maintained, I'm going to simplify it, right? But in a simplified way, it maintained that you can pretty much print as much money as you want, don't worry about it. And people said, maybe modern monetary theory is correct. You can print as much money as you want, don't worry about it. How do I know this? Because we're printing massive amounts of money and we're not seeing the inflation. And we're saying, yeah, you were seeing it, you're just looking in the wrong place. Because when we calculate inflation, we look at the rise in the prices of goods and services. Stocks and bonds aren't included in inflation calculations. So if you pump a bunch of money into the system and it goes not into goods and services markets, but it goes into financial markets, you'll see financial asset prices rise and you won't see goods and services prices rise, but it's this goods and services that we use to measure inflation. So again, we say it was hiding here. And if you look at the actual data, this is like going back to 2013. Across the bottom, growth in the money supply, up and down inflation. And I've had people send me this picture and say, look, you're completely wrong about money and inflation. The modern monetary theory people are correct. You can go ahead and print as much as you want. And this picture is their evidence because you look at this thing and there's not much action going on here, right? If indeed money caused inflation, I would expect that as you move to the right, this thing goes up. Now, if you squint really hard, maybe it does, but there's not much, it's just a cloud of dots. So people say, look, there's no relationship between money supply and inflation. Yeah, now watch this. I'm going to include not just inflation, but also the S&P 500. And now you get the relationship that mainstream economists have been saying exists for a long time. But if you pump up the money supply, you get inflation. So what happened? The money growth during COVID, this is to pay for all the checks that we got. How many of you got stimulus checks back in 2020? Yeah, that was great. It's a lot of fun. This check out of nowhere. Everybody said, this is wonderful. Imagine if the economy actually worked like this, that the government would just cut his checks and we could just spend it and it'd be wonderful.
I went out and bought guitars. It
Yeah,
was great.
It's free money.
Free money.
Quote unquote free. Well, where'd it come from? We printed the dollars. That's what you got. Well, those dollars landed mostly in financial markets, pushing up stock prices. Stock prices aren't included in inflation calculations, so inflation was low. And everybody says, this is the new economy. We can have free money at no cost.
We should say that we invited the mother of MMT, Stephanie Kelton, to talk to us about this on the podcast, and she didn't even reply by email. I mean, there's just nothing.
Once the crisis turns, what happens? The money starts to come out of, and we actually predicted this back in 2021 when the stock market was still booming. By that time, we'd figured out, we had our hypothesis of what's happening here, that the inflation's hiding in financial markets. And we said, if we're right, here's what's going to happen. As the threat of COVID wanes, people are going to become comfortable. People are going to go back to work. Businesses are going to start investing. They're going to start rehiring, all of this stuff. And as that happens, all this money that people have socked away into financial markets, they're now going to start to pull out and they're going to start to spend. And when that happens, if we're correct, you'll observe two things. One is the stock market will turn, start to come down, and the other is you'll start to see serious inflation. That is, we will take our money out of financial markets, causing stock prices to drop, put it into goods and services markets, where now we measure inflation. You'll start to see the prices go up. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. We want to talk about what happens next, and this is a warning. And I know it's all near and dear to your hearts, this idea of student loan forgiveness. Trust me, it's near and dear to my heart as well. I'm an academic. And so long as we do student loan forgiveness, I'm guaranteed a job. Because there's going to be all sorts of students wanting to come and be in my classroom. Some of them, serious students like you. A lot of them, people who have just realized that they can get a 4-year all-expenses-paid vacation, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. So that's going to guarantee me work. It's going to be good for you as well. However, we argue it's not good on the whole. The Congressional Budget Office makes predictions every year of what's going to happen in the economy 5 years, 10 years out into the future. When you hear politicians, when you hear people in news media saying economists project that we're going to have trillion-dollar deficits for the next 10 years, largely they're quoting these people, the Congressional Budget Office. They projected that in 2021, the federal debt would be 7 times the federal revenue. They're projecting federal debt is going to go up and up to 2031. And although the federal debt's going to go up, the Congressional Budget Office anticipates that the economy will grow faster than the debt grows. So that while the debt is 7 times federal revenues today, it's going to be only 6.5 times federal revenues come 2031. That's not correct because the CBO has a track record, and James and I have pulled this data and analyzed it going back to the 1970s. CBO has a consistent track record of being optimistic, and they're optimistic on both sides. When you ask them to project federal tax revenues into the future, they are almost always, and by almost I mean 80% of the time, over anticipating how much federal tax revenues will be in the future. And when you ask them project federal spending in the future, they're always, and by always I mean 90+% of the time, under anticipating federal spending. So they're biased rosy in both directions here. And this is the organization that the federal government relies on. When congressmen, when senators are coming up with some new bill that's going to raise taxes or spending or whatever it is, they turn to the CBO and they say, the term is score. They say, score this. Score it means, tell me what is this going to do to our tax revenues, to our spending, to our deficit, 5, 10 years into the future. These guys are actually quite professional. The problem here isn't them. It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're malicious. It's not that they're partisan. It's the law. Under the law, the CBO must incorporate into its projections any assumptions they're given. If I'm a congressman and I say, all right, look, I want to double the income tax on the rich, and I want you, CBO, to tell me what that's going to do to tax revenues. Oh, and I want you to assume that this increase, the doubling of the tax, has no effect on investment or business creation. Well, that's stupid. Of course it's going to have an effect on investment and business creation, but the CBO has to assume that it won't, because that's the assumption that's given.
This is why CBO will always be wrong.
Right. And I could give you an interesting example of this. Back when President Obama was in office, and this would have been just at the tail end of the 2008 housing crisis, the economy was down, all kinds of problems here, unemployment was up. They were scoring his Affordable Care Act. And he comes out with a statement and says, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that the Affordable Care Act will not add much to the deficit. In fact, it can in later years pay for itself, right? All this kind of stuff. So I dig into the numbers to see how, in God's name, they came up with this conclusion that you could have a national healthcare system that isn't going to increase the deficit. And it turns out CBO assumed, and I know it's not because they thought it was right, it was because they were told to assume it, assumed that once the Affordable Care Act was put into place, the economy would grow for the next 10 years at dot-com level growth. Dot-com level growth was unprecedented, save for the rebound from the Great Depression perhaps. But to assume that we would get dot-com level growth for 1 year, let alone 10 in a row, is completely ridiculous. And yet that's the assumption that made the numbers look good, and politicians want the numbers to look good so they can sell it to you. And I'm picking on President Obama there, and that's not a partisan thing. Politicians on both sides of the aisle do the exact same thing. So that's CBO projections, and yes, it's 10 years into the future, and you might say, well, it's hard to predict 10 years into the future. How about 5 years? And you get the same kind of story. 5 years out, typically they're about a quarter too low when they're forecasting the debt. So what does that mean for us? As of right now, CBO is projecting that by 2031, the debt's going to be $40 trillion. Now let's suppose CBO is wrong here by the same amount that it has been wrong in the past. So 10 years out, it's been under forecasting the debt by about 50%, 60%. Suppose it's also off by about 50 or 60%. What that means is the actual debt we'll be looking at by 2031, 90 plus trillion.
Even that seems optimistic.
That's assuming that they're just off by the same amount as in the past. Now, you can look at that and you can say, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Nobody's going to believe that by 2031, the debt's going to be 1,500% of the federal revenues. I have difficulty believing it as well. You tell me 90 trillion, that's ridiculous. We're going to triple the debt over the next 10 years, but I refer you backwards. In 2012, CBO projected that the debt would be 475% of tax revenues. As of right now, it's actually 760% of tax revenues. So what's happening here is our debt is doubling about every 8 years. If you know anything about biology, this thing about, you put the one cell, and if it divides every half hour, it doesn't seem like much, it's just one cell. But you divide every half hour, by the end of the week, it's got more cells than can fit in the entire universe. That's the effect of this exponential growth from doubling. And that's what we've got here. It's about every 8 to 9 years, historically, our federal debt doubles. The moral of this story is, be careful when politicians tell you that you can have free stuff, whether it's healthcare or it's education or it's phones or whatever it is. They're going to be relying more and more as time goes on this argument that we can print money without worrying about inflation. Because look, we the voters, we like free stuff. And free stuff means what? It means the government's spending money but not raising my taxes. And something's got to give. If we're going to spend money and not raise taxes, we've got to print it.
And if you think that the reserve currency status holds a lot of water, go talk to the English. because the English pound was once the global reserve currency.
Yeah, there's an argument here that modern monetary theory will give you, is that, look, you can go ahead and print the dollars because our dollars are, and this is the word they use, a reserve currency. What that means is people around the world use U.S. dollars as an investment. You've got money, you invest it in U.S. dollars because they hold their value. Yeah, well, here's the thing. The U.S. dollar is a reserve currency, but it's not a reserve currency by law. It's a reserve currency by acclamation. That is, everybody looked around and said, hey, look, that U.S. dollar, it holds its value. You got some extra money, invest in that.
The minute something better comes along, the U.S. dollar is out.
It's the case until you start inflating it like we're doing. We have another couple of years of 8-9% inflation. The rest of the world's going to say that the U.S. dollar does not hold its value. We're going to look for something else. And if that sounds strange to you, think about the British pound. When my father was a kid, the British pound was the reserve, that was the global currency. And they inflated it away. And now nobody talks about the British pound that much. We had these three barriers to the federal government. The Constitution, which we can argue that is a good or a bad idea, and I'm not arguing one way or the other, I'm simply saying that it was a barrier and now it isn't. The voters all of a sudden want unlimited borrowing. Politicians are going to give us what we want. Why? Because we vote them in. And if they don't give us what we want, we're going to vote somebody else in.
And remember, every single politician says the same thing. They start running for re-election the day after they take office.
Yeah.
Re-election is the first goal. There are other goals, but they're pretty far down the chain.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, because people will say things like, I'll ask them, what do you think the politician's goal is? And we all learn this in high school. The politician's goal is to serve society, to seek the common good. To which I say, no, that's maybe in theory, but in practice, what's the politician's goal? And the politician's goal is to win elections. And how do you know that? Because if you give me two politicians who are identical in every way, except one, this guy's primary goal is to seek the common good, and this guy's primary goal is to get elected. On average, this guy's going to win. On average, the people who win elections are going to be the people whose primary goal it is to win elections. And so they're going to give us what we want, and without the Constitution giving a legal boundary on government spending, with voters wanting all this free stuff, with not having a gold standard, now we can print as much money as we want, we have unlimited financing, all of this ends exactly where we are, with a whole bunch of inflation. And it's not going to get better. Our back-of-the-envelope calculation is, and I could tell you this, the CBO anticipates that we're going to have trillion-dollar-plus deficits for the next decade, every single year, and I've already shown you how rosy their assumptions are. If we have to finance that through money printing to the same extent we have been financing spending through monetary printing, we're anticipating we're going to see permanent 5% inflation.
That's right.
And that's a good case scenario.
That's a best case scenario, and we're not close to a best case scenario. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.